You use the term progressivism, and we hear that term progressive today. I mean, being used quite a bit. What's your definition of that?
My students always ask that, and it takes a while to explain it. What progressivism meant at the time was people wanted a more efficient government. They wanted a government and a social order generally that was dedicated to harmonizing social relations. And they also wanted a government that would be more small d democratic. And part of that was that the progressives wanted to try to either bust up the big businesses in America or regulate them much more strictly.
Was this the first election in which progressivism had a voice?
No, no. I wrote a biography of William Jennings Bryan who ran in 1896. In many ways, even though the term wasn't used at the time, he was, I think, a very early progressive, though he was defeated in 1896.
Professor, were you going to comment on that?
I was just going to say, shifting the focus slightly from presidential level to how people imagined it on the ground.
Right.
Progressivism had a very accessible concept to everyday people who wanted a better quality of life, who wanted certain state responses at the local level, even things such as political reform to make sure that corrupt politicians were held accountable or more responsive to voters. So even at the local level, you get certain kinds of referendums that come into place that allow for everyday voters to be much more invested in who would represent them. Police reform is on the tables. You get the professionalization of all sorts of grassroots organizations that can be responsible in ways that the federal government might or might not have been, but they didn't just start at the top.
So to you, what do you see? What's your stand on the 100th anniversary of 1912? Why does 1912 matter 100 years later?
Well, for me, what's interesting about it is there's this wonderful moment where African American leadership in this election really don't know where to go. They are looking at Roosevelt, who had all the promise of representing the best traditions of the Republican Party, symbolically represented by Lincoln. He came into his position, obviously, in the wake of McKinley's assassination, courting African American voters, but his star had dimmed greatly by 1912. Even though he talked a tough game when it came to progressivism, he was courting Southern delegates in this third-party race. So they weren't certain if they could. This is really the first time that the Republican Party is not the heir apparent for African American voters, who are few in number because of disenfranchisement. As it turns out, Du Bois writes in reference to Woodrow Wilson, who is the sort of dark horse of the moment, that he hopes he's the president of all the people. And I think that actually resonates so profoundly with this particular moment because we have just the opposite in play. If a Du Bois, who's one of the leading intellectuals of this moment, is banking on Woodrow Wilson as a Democratic candidate who represents, as a party leader, the traditions of a white supremacist party in terms of everything following the Civil War, Du Bois sees in Woodrow Wilson a kind of intellectualism, a kind of professionalism, a kind of thoughtful leadership that could ultimately lead to him being the president of all of the people. Well, the rhetoric today is almost completely the reverse. The president of all the people in the 2012 election is to push back against the potential for the president having special interests like African American voters or Latino voters. So there's an interesting arc over 100 years in how that language is used in terms of this sort of big tent approach to reform and change.
I think it's very important what Khalil said, that the whole language of the people against the special interests really is created in the progressive era, not just 1912, but before then too. And you have a lot of ambiguities and contradictions in reform because there are a lot of Southern progressives, white Southern progressives, who think Jim Crow is a progressive measure. They think only when white people and black people can develop separately will they not get in each other's way. And you've got, of course, a lot of dispute between people like Booker T. Washington on one side and W. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells on the other side. But also the progressive era is important now because, I mean, think of a lot of the institutions we have today, a lot of the important laws we have today. The Income Tax Amendment becomes part of the Constitution in 1913. direct election of senators becomes part of the Constitution in 1913.
And these were progressive planks.
Oh yes, very much so.
Food and Drug Administration.
Yeah.
So even the regulatory state that we take for granted
Yeah.
on one hand and is subject to criticism and attack on the other came into being in the progressive period.
And for some conservatives like Glenn Beck, who doesn't represent all conservatives, but some conservatives like Glenn Beck say, America started down the bad road in 1912.
Right.
Woodrow Wilson was the beginning of the left's triumph, making a huge Leviathan state.